Welcome. Welcome to this week's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here at PC and the director of the Humanities Forum. The forum exists to provide a regular space each week for the college community to reflect together on some of the deepest questions we face as human beings. One of the most important ways the forum does that is to partner with academic conferences happening here on campus. And it's an honor for the forum this week to host the keynote address of the Providence College Tocqueville Conference. Let me take a moment to extend a special welcome to our campus to those conference attendees who are with us this afternoon. In addition, if any of you are interested to the events happening tomorrow as a part of the conference, there are programs at the back of the room next to each of the doors, and I invite all of you to take a schedule with you before you leave this afternoon. It's now my distinct honor to introduce Arthur Goldhammer, this afternoon's conference keynote speaker and this week's guest. Since 1991, the senior affiliate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, Dr. Goldhammer is a four-time winner of the French-American Foundation Translation Prize, an officer of the French Order of Arts and Letters, and is, quite simply, our country's foremost French-language translator. His more than 120 translations include all of Alexis de Tocqueville's major works, classics by Condorcet, Diderot, Émile Zola, and Albert Camus, and scholarly works in philosophy and the history of science, literary theory, history, and sociology. He was the obvious choice as translator for Thomas Piketty's recent Capitalism in the 21st Century, and perhaps, I can't help thinking, his PhD in mathematics from MIT in 1973 helped smooth the way even more for this. One of my personal favorites, by the way, he's the translator for a graphic novel version of Marcel Proust's Swann's Way. I think we should all order that immediately after this afternoon's talk. In addition to his translation work, he is a widely published scholar focusing primarily on French history, politics, and culture, and has been a longtime member of the editorial boards of the Tocqueville Review and French Politics, Culture, and Society. He writes a blog on contemporary French politics for Tocqueville 21, and his extensive writing on European and American politics has appeared most recently in Democracy Journal, The American Prospect, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Le Point, Le Monde, and other journals. His writings also include a novel, Shooting War, and such wonderfully titled essays as Fictions Not Intended to Deceive and How to Do Things with Style. On a more personal note, I was privileged to be a member of a 2016 National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminar on Alexis de Tocqueville, hosted by Art and his friend and collaborator, the Tocqueville scholar Olivier Zunes at the University of Virginia. A couple of my colleagues from that seminar are also here as part of the conference. Art and Olivier were consummate hosts, models of intellectual grace and generosity, and I know I speak for all the participants when I say that they give us precious examples of scholarly lives well lived. Art himself has described his own vocation as a translator as lifting the veil of language. This is a beautifully appropriate description of what he has given us in his life, how to do things with style, indeed. He'll be speaking this afternoon on Does Democracy Require an Active Citizenry? A Tocquevillian View. Please join me in welcoming Arthur Goldhammer.
Thank you, Raymond, for that very kind introduction. I hope you all can hear me. I'm planning for the first time to use the computer as my text, so I hope this all works. I do have a printed backup in case it doesn't. So as Raymond just mentioned, we met at Tocqueville seminar at the University of Virginia that I co-taught with Olivier Zunes. And my remarks today really are an outgrowth of a discussion at that seminar. One afternoon, the talk had turned to Tocqueville's preference for an active over a passive citizenry, which runs all through democracy in America, from his idealization of the New England town with its town meetings and regular rotation of officials, to the contrast he draws between the can-do activism he witnesses in America and the passivity he castigates in. Sorry. No one ever calls me except when I'm speaking. The passivity he castigates in his French compatriots, whom he describes as content to allow a road or a vestry to fall to ruin while awaiting help from the state. Association, which demands participation, is his antidote for the ills of democracy. Individualism, the selfish withdrawal from the public into the familial sphere, is the anesthetic that allows soft despotism to position its yoke unmolested around the necks of a once free citizenry. So goes Tocqueville's argument. The argument in favor of an active citizenry seemed to me so obvious that I was unprepared for a question raised by a member of the seminar, Alec Arellano, for those of you who are there, who asked why active engagement in political life should be considered preferable to passive disengagement. Might not a proclivity for political activity be a taste, to use a word that Tocqueville favors, rather than a categorical imperative? At the time, I was so stuck on my straightforward interpretation of the participatory theme in Tocqueville that I simply mumbled an incoherent and I'm sure unconvincing defense of my preferred reading. I should have tried to draw out the reasons for my young colleague's skepticism. Perhaps, as I thought at the time, he was simply expressing his own doubts about the superiority of a politically engaged life. But perhaps he had noticed Tocqueville's own doubts on this score, which, as we shall see, turn out to be quite as striking as his arguments for engagement. And how could it be otherwise? Because, as Tocqueville tells us repeatedly, his animating passion is liberty. Only through considerable intellectual effort has he been able to reconcile himself to equality. Now, to enjoy full liberty, a man must be free to choose to alienate himself from his fellow man, hence to withdraw from public life into the sphere of family and private pleasures, the very purgatory of individualism that Tocqueville denounces with such force, even though Benjamin Constant, the quintessential liberal of the generation before Tocqueville's, identified the right to alienate oneself from the public sphere as the very essence of the liberty of the moderns, as he called it. Of course, as Jan Elster and other commentators have often noted, such blithe self-contradiction is part of Tocqueville's charm. But it wouldn't be completely honest of me to leave you with the impression that it was only this brief and unsatisfactory seminar discussion that set me on the path of reflection that led to my remarks today. In fact, as our seminar was taking place, the Republican Party was meeting in its 2016 nominating convention, which resulted in the nomination and ultimately the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. On the day after the now disgraced General Michael Flynn made his notorious convention speech, in which he led delegates in a chant of "lock her up," her being the presidential candidate of the rival party, thus exemplifying in a particularly vivid way one of Tocqueville's warnings about how democracy could fail if the victorious majority used its democratically bestowed sovereign powers to criminalize the opposition. On that day, I found myself before class in the campus Starbucks, where I ran into another member of our seminar. We commiserated on the insanity of the political moment, and I recall remarking that the sight of those frenzied Republicans, their faces contorted with hatred, calling for the imprisonment of the woman I then believed would be the next president of the United States, put me in mind of Tocqueville's comment on his discovery of the Montagnard delegation in the Constituent Assembly elected after the Revolution of 1848. The passage is so vivid that I can't resist quoting it in full. From where I sat, Tocqueville wrote, I could easily hear what was said and see what was done on the Montagnard benches. I had the opportunity to study rather closely the men who inhabited that part of the chamber. For me, it was like discovering a new world. We console ourselves for our lack of knowledge of foreign countries by telling ourselves that at least we know our own, but we are wrong. For there are always regions we have not visited and races of men of which we know nothing. I felt this strongly at the time. It It was as if I were seeing those Montagnards for the first time, for their idiom and manners were so strange to me. They spoke a jargon that was neither the French of the ignorant nor that of the literate, but suffered from the defects of both, for it was full of coarse words and ambitious turns of phrase. These men were clearly no more at home in the tavern than in the salon. I suspect they had polished their manners in the in-between space of the cafes and nourished their minds solely on newspapers. Their kind had previously been represented only by isolated and obscure individuals who had been more concerned with hiding their presence than with flaunting it. The point in this passage, of which I had been forcefully reminded by the previous evening's viewing of the Republican Convention, was that we are wrong, as Tocqueville observed, to think that we know our own countries. There are always parts of the population that remain out of sight and out of mind until, by becoming active citizens themselves, they intrude themselves forcefully on our view. What I failed to notice, however, preoccupied as I was with the belief that Tocqueville's case for the viability of democracy rested in large part on his discussion of the virtues of an active citizenry, was that this passage is also a powerful blast against his own thesis. For Tocqueville, it was hard to believe that minds nourished solely on newspapers, or to bring it up to date, on Fox News and Breitbart, like the Republican conventioneers, could exercise mature judgment on matters of state. Wasn't he really arguing here that the collective good would be better served if heads stuffed with partisan propaganda and incapable of independent judgment did not participate in the political life of democracy? Now, parenthetically, I should add that Tocqueville's judgment of the Montagnard delegates was quite partial. The point is not whether his prejudices, or mine, concerning the Republicans, were correct, but rather that our confidence in democracy could be so easily shaken by the discovery that our representations of the demos, our internal understanding of what the population, the voting population consisted of, had been so woefully incomplete. Now, extrapolating from this incident, one might think that he would have worried also about relying on associations to resist the will of the supposedly omnipotent majority. Any association strong enough to resist the central power might also become strong enough to subvert it, to impose a minority tyranny even more fearsome than the majority tyranny that Tocqueville deplored. The more I began to reflect on the theme of political participation in Tocqueville, the more I became convinced that the case was more complicated than I initially believed. His scattered comments on active citizenship reveal a deep ambivalence about what he calls the dogma of popular sovereignty, deriving from a deeper ambivalence about the nature of man, half beast and half angel, as Pascal, one of the very few philosophers he constantly read and reread, liked to say. Now, with these prefatory remarks out of the way, let me lay out the bare bones of my argument. Tocqueville, though deeply ambivalent about the prospects of democracy, persuaded himself that it might just be viable if its inherent destructive forces could be contained. And he proposed a model of how this might work in a large republic like the United States. It was a model that invoked equality of conditions as the idée mère, the fundamental idea of democracy, yet viewed the population of equal citizens as mere dust, without the consistency required to resist the political tyranny of the central power, the potential tyranny of the central power, I should say. Resistance could come only from intermediary bodies, a concept that Tocqueville borrowed from Montesquieu. For Tocqueville, associations, which he saw everywhere in the United States, were to play the role that Montesquieu assigned to the aristocracy. The viability of democracy was thus to depend on a tripartite structure: central power, central government, intermediary bodies, and people. This could collapse, however, if any two of its components coalesced against the third. Such, in Tocqueville's view, was the fate that had befallen the Ancien Régime in France. The central power had severed the aristocracy's local roots, fatally attracting it into its own orbit. Could American democracy avoid an analogous type of disequilibrium? That was one of Tocqueville's fundamental questions. Well, he thought it might if a certain form of socialization, which he saw at work in the New England town, prevailed. The chief purpose of socialization via the town, I will argue, was to apprise the citizen of the limits of his capacity to govern. The problem, however, is that even if this form of socialization once existed, it no longer does. So it can no longer play the essential role that Tocqueville assigned it. His model is therefore of little use in thinking about the crisis of contemporary democracy, which I will characterize as a democracy of the spectacle, to be defined later, in which identification with the executive as the incarnation of the general will has become the chief form of participation, supplanting association at the grassroots. And now for some details. Let us begin at the beginning, at the place that Tocqueville sees as the blazing hearth, this is his metaphor, from which the gentle heat of healthy democratic mores will gradually spread to warm hearts in rougher parts of the country, namely the New England town. For Tocqueville, the town is more a social form than a political one. Bear in mind his distinction between a democratic polity and a democratic society, or democratic social state, to use his term. Although the town is nominally a political construct, it interests Tocqueville primarily as the fundamental cell of the social organism, the matrix in which the democratic character is formed. It is in the town that the New Englander, and I quote here, invests his ambition and his future and participates in all aspects of community life. In the limited sphere that is within his reach, he tries his hand at governing society. He becomes accustomed to the forms without which liberty advances only by way of revolution, becomes imbued with their spirit, develops a taste for order, comprehends the harmony of powers, and finally acquires clear and practical ideas about the nature of his duties and the extent of his rights. End quote. So the town's chief function is therefore social, not political. It educates the ordinary citizen, shapes his ambition and his future. In the lexicon of sociology, it socializes him. Note how Tocqueville here circumscribes the action of the town's typical citizen within a limited sphere. There, his role in government is that of an apprentice. He can try his hand, as Tocqueville puts it, and thus learn directly that governing is not easy. This, Tocqueville states, is a necessary lesson, because in societies whose members do not learn it, a false idea of freedom takes hold, namely the idea that the past can be wiped away and everything made anew overnight, which he calls the way of revolution. And here he's obviously drawing on his knowledge of the French Revolution, his own family's experience in it. His great uncle was executed. His parents avoided execution by one day. So that the hope for immediate, dramatic, revolutionary change is a forlorn hope is, according to Tocqueville, the paramount lesson that every citizen of democracy must be taught. In place of this forlorn hope, the good citizen must acquire not just a knowledge of, but also a taste for order, as he puts it, along with a comprehension of the harmony of powers. Now, note the plurality of powers in that passage. In the well-ordered society, power speaks with many voices, as in the New England town, with its rotating slate of town officers, chosen at random by lot from among the members of the town meeting. But these voices work in concert. They are harmonized. Rather than inflame abstract revolutionary fantasies, the town teaches the citizen only practical ideas for making use of his inherently limited rights. In other words, it is through the town and its gentle socialization of egalitarian man's innate restlessness, that's Tocqueville's word, that society accomplishes its slow and tranquil work on itself, which is Tocqueville's definition of an orderly republic, a society that accomplishes slow and tranquil work on itself. Now, Tocqueville enlarged the example of the New England town to encompass a more comprehensive model of active citizenship, namely the association. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that he finds the American penchant for association as astonishing as the American accommodation of equality. He sees associations of 1,000 kinds. Quote, Americans associate to give fete, to found seminaries, to build inns. This is how they create hospitals, prisons, and schools. To publicize a truth or foster a sentiment, they associate. Wherever there is a new undertaking at the head of which you would expect to see in France, the government, and in England, some great lord, in the United States, you are sure to find an association. Under conditions of equality, Tocqueville says, all citizens are independent and weak. They become helpless if they do not learn to help one another. Hence, in democratic nations, associations must take the place of the powerful private individuals who've been eliminated by equality of conditions. Associations are thus ideas made flesh and endowed with power. They fill the role that Montesquieu assigned to intermediary bodies, giving backbone to a society that would otherwise remain amorphous and invertebrate, molding the dust of isolated individuals into fortresses capable of withstanding the onslaughts of would-be tyrants. Associations are also the antidote to that other evil of democracy, individualism, which for Tocqueville is a vice peculiar to democratic societies. When citizens become inactive, their sympathies shrink. But when they are, quote, forced to concern themselves with public affairs, they are inevitably drawn beyond the sphere of their individual interests. Their attention is diverted from themselves, end quote. This is perhaps his clearest statement that an inactive citizenry threatens democracy by narrowing horizons and thus inhibiting the conception of self-interest properly understood. Let me note in passing that Tocqueville is here drawing once again upon Pascal, who criticized Montaigne precisely for dwelling so much on himself. Le sot projet qu'il a de se peindre, the foolish project he has of describing himself, was Pascal's reaction to reading Montaigne's essays. But he forgets that Pascal, a Jansenist, did in fact withdraw from public life, albeit to devote his thoughts not to himself, but to God. Now, all this amounts to a robust defense of an active citizenry, where active connotes engaged, associative, public-spirited, and when necessary, self-sacrificing. We know that Tocqueville developed his appreciation of the socializing virtues of the town meeting without ever attending one. What he knew, he learned from a book entitled The Town Officer, which was handed to him on the Harvard campus by Jared Sparks, then a professor of history who later went on to become president of Harvard. To rely on a book might seem incongruous for the writer who would later so fiercely denounce the Enlightenment's saloniers for their bookish generalizations. He judged the town to be of too little political importance to devote any of his limited time in America to discussing it firsthand, to studying it firsthand. For him, the town was important primarily as a socializing instrument. Its role in the operation of the state was negligible. It mattered to him only because mores are more important than laws, and it was in the town, which he took to be the basic cell of the social organism, that mores were molded. Like the family, the town, in Tocqueville's view, stemmed from nature itself. It is, quote, the only association that is so much a part of nature that wherever men come together, towns naturally form, end quote. But unlike the conservative theorists of the Restoration, Tocqueville believed that the family could no longer play the fundamental socializing role in a democratic society, for reasons that would take me too far afield to discuss here. Associations, as Tocqueville's analog to Montesquieu's aristocracy, had a loftier role to play. As ideas made flesh, they embodied democratic society's capacity for resistance against the state. But if ideas can be made flesh, so can superstitions, prejudices, and baseless opinions. When this happens, the association's capacity to resist the central power becomes a vice rather than a virtue. And democratic politics devolves from deliberation among what Tocqueville called great parties, promoting noble ideas, to a contest unfolding on a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night. So even if the town does teach useful skills, and even if those skills do spill over into a general capacity for association, participation at the local level need not eventuate in a healthy state. Tocqueville, in fact, never claimed that it would. For him, the primary function of local participation was not to impart the skills needed for governance. It was rather to teach humility, to counter democratic man's prideful assumption that everything can be bent to his will. The town taught that man's powers are limited rather than infinite, and thus deflated revolutionary hubris. It offered instruction in the need for trade-offs among competing interests. It imparted knowledge of fiscal, physical, procedural, and organizational constraints. It chastened those who imagined that the purpose of political activity was to impose their own will or serve their own interests. It was meant, Tocqueville claimed, to enlarge the concept of individual interest so as to achieve that harmonic convergence of individualities that he hopefully dubbed self-interest properly understood. Ideally, then, participation taught people to know their limits. This is my key point. Local empowerment taught global deference. The argument is reminiscent of Tocqueville's strictures concerning the need for authority in intellectual matters. Democracy, he says, is naturally Cartesian. It promotes a corrosive skepticism of authority and encourages individuals to rely, often rashly, on their own lights, informed only by their own experience and unaided reason. This is presumptuous and therefore dangerous. No one has the time or talent to work out for himself everything he needs to know about the world. The best one can do is to select judiciously the authorities to which one submits. If the function of the democratic school is to teach this lesson in the intellectual sphere, the function of the town is to teach it in the political sphere. So let me pause a moment to recapitulate the argument to this point. Tocqueville praised participation at the local level because he believed it would teach citizens to refrain from demanding to participate too directly in decision-making at higher levels. We know that he studied the Federalist carefully and that he particularly admired James Madison's contributions to that work. In Federalist 63, Madison wrote that the true distinction of the new system of government created in Philadelphia, quote, lies in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in actually making decisions of policy. Now, the words that I tried to emphasize with my voice, in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity, Madison wrote that in all capitals in his text. The emphatic capitalization is from the original. This passage strengthens the case for believing that Tocqueville saw the function of an active citizenry primarily as a mechanism of socialization within a hierarchy of deference. Tocqueville believed that experience in local government would, through the compromises and constraints it required, broaden sympathy, promote mutual comprehension, and enlarge the individual's temporal horizon. The democratic state, whose stability philosophers had doubted throughout most of history, could survive only if citizens learned to recognize the limited sphere beyond which they should be wary of their own judgment. So Tocqueville's ideal, typical democratic republic looks something like this. Being a republic, it is defined by its slow and tranquil action on itself, which begins with the citizens' gentle socialization through the town meeting and rotation through town offices. This experience gradually enlarges his conception of his self-interest. When needs transcending the capabilities of isolated individuals arise, citizens thus socialized will naturally form associations to promote their views, availing themselves of newspapers and other media to promulgate them beyond the borders of the town. Distinguished individuals will emerge from these associations to champion common interests. Taken together, these three ingredients, an active citizenry enlightened as to its self-interest through its participation in local government, freedom of association, and freedom of the press, suffice to create the intermediary bodies that Tocqueville, following Montesquieu, thought necessary as a bulwark against majority tyranny and administrative centralization. They would, moreover, create a citizenry circumspect about its capacity to govern and a sovereign prepared to heed the wise counsel of those better versed in the art and science of governing. Those last words are Tocqueville's. Now, even if this prescription for a healthy democracy were correct, would we find it comforting? I think not. Look around. Three problems stand out. First, Tocqueville's conception of the citizenry is at once too concrete and too unrealistic. The local no longer exists, or at any rate is no longer the place where political socialization occurs. We, the people, no longer live in New England towns or Renaissance city-states. We occupy an indeterminate space constituted not by concrete interactions, but by our mediated impressions of people and events, some proximate, others quite remote. We form our representations of one another not through face-to-face exchanges, but through what we have come to call the media, whose ambit is global, almost to the exclusion of the local. The neat Tocquevillian Montesquieuian triad of governors, governed, and intermediary bodies, concretized in the spatial metaphor of center, periphery, and in between, has given way to a complex, fluid manifold. Call it the democracy of the spectacle, in which governors no less than governed are spectators as well as actors. As David Runciman puts it in How Democracies End, quote, democratic politics has become an elaborate show, needing ever more characterful performers to hold the public's attention, end quote. Second, elite and people stand in a relation of mutual incomprehension. The so-called general will, or in Tocqueville's kinder, gentler formulation, self-interest properly understood, is a fusion or confusion of contradictory desires. We the people want our children educated, our diseases cured, our bridges and roads maintained, and our borders defended, but are reluctant to pay taxes to those ends. We want the fluctuations of the economy tamped down, but disagree violently about the government's competence to do so. We want clean air and water, but also all the conveniences of an energy-intensive industrial society, and so on ad infinitum. The tension between the unweeded garden of the general will and the orderly jardin français of bureaucratic reason is the mainspring of the democratic spectacle. Third, Tocqueville's conception of the people is too homogeneous. He tended to think of the people as divided between the propertied and the unpropertied. His active citizenry was therefore modeled on the active citizenry of the French constitutional monarchy, in which the amount of property one owned determined one's eligibility to vote. That was also the case here in Rhode Island until sometime in the 1820s, I think. He had little feeling for the durable resentments created by failures of social mobility, racial and ethnic differences, or the educational divide so prominent in contemporary American voting patterns. Some citizens come to feel that their desires go permanently unrepresented, and therefore that their sovereignty has been usurped, while others, rejecting these complaints as ill-informed and unreasonable, protest that democracy has devolved into mere populism. What is to be done? We find it difficult to recognize Tocqueville's disciplined and deferential democracy. The local no longer exists. The town meeting model of government has all but vanished. Even where it is still practiced, as in small town New Hampshire, the reality of town government is quite different from what Tocqueville imagined, as Jane Mansbridge's work shows. Mansbridge spent a considerable time studying one town in New Hampshire in the 1980s, and it worked nothing like Tocqueville's imagined town meeting. In Eastern Europe after 1989, there was a brief vogue for Tocqueville's work. The US government sent copies of Democracy in America to Prague and Warsaw and Budapest, hoping to promote burgeoning town meetings in the hinterlands of these old world capitals, just liberated from the yoke of administrative centralization under communism. But civic-minded local associations proved to be no match for associations of acquisitive oligarchs and xenophobic populists. Democracy without elites is not viable, but Tocqueville's image of an elite arising naturally, organically, out of local face-to-face interactions strikes us as a phantasm. He hoped, for instance, that civil society would find enlightened leadership in lawyers and editors of local newspapers. This choice reveals how his mental image of the state was still dominated by the Ancien Régime model, with the lawyer preoccupied with the mundane affairs of his clients and thus rooted in his locality and blessedly remote from the center, standing in for the benign aristocrat devoted to the welfare of his tenants, and with the editor playing the part of a cultivated official like Tocqueville's father, Hervé, the prefect with his library well stocked with the classics. Though elite, such leaders, Tocqueville supposed, would retain their local roots. They would draw their sustenance from civil society rather than from the state. They would not become déracinés, those rootless cerebrals whom the novelist Maurice Barrès would later skewer as the bane of France's centripetal republic. Yet these intermediary elites suffer from vices of their own, which Tocqueville knew full well. Their very distance from the center of power leaves them underinformed and parochial in their views, hence vulnerable to the belief that government error is easily reformed. Tocqueville had no use for the naive reformist zeal underpinned by abstract speculation, the vice he believed had contributed to the undermining of the Ancien Régime. Overzealous pre-revolutionary reformers suffered from the mistaken belief that one could easily replace complex traditional customs, this is quoting Tocqueville, with simple elementary rules, which could be deduced from reason and natural law, end quote. Worse still, such illusions could all too easily spread beyond the salons of the radical chic. Even experience failed to confer immunity. It is not surprising, Tocqueville wrote, that the nobility and bourgeoisie, which had been excluded from public life for so long, this is before the French Revolution, displayed such striking inexperience. What is more astonishing, however, is that the very men in charge of affairs, ministers, magistrates, intendants, exhibited a little more foresight. They possessed thorough knowledge of the details of public administration, but when it came to the great science of government, in Tocqueville's resonant phrase, which teaches one to understand the general direction of society, to judge what is going on in the minds of the masses, and to anticipate what will come of it, they were quite as untutored as the people themselves. To make matters worse, the court and the city fatally attracted aspiring talent to themselves, alienating the enlightened from the masses. This, in Tocqueville's view, was the curse of the Ancien Régime, and it could easily become the curse of centralized democratic government as well. Tocqueville hoped that the Americans might have found a remedy for this malady by pioneering two novel democratic institutions, public schools and the decentralized local press. In the intellectual realm, these two institutions were to play the same role as towns in the realm of government. In the US, unlike France, enlightenment, like power, is disseminated throughout this vast country, Tocqueville wrote. Hence, the beams of human intelligence do not all emanate from a common center. Nowhere have the Americans established any direction over their thinking. Excuse me. And yet, as if suddenly awakening to the possibility that he might be overstating the extent of American enlightenment, he followed up this enthusiastic paean with a series of more sober reflections. Even in America, despite the disseminated free press, people cling to their opinions as much out of pride as out of conviction. Even in America, despite the vastly more favorable conditions there for intelligent political debate, the reflective, self-assured conviction that grows out of knowledge and emerges from the agitation of doubt itself will never be granted to more than a very small number of men as a reward for their efforts. Enlightenment is thus inherently elitist, in Tocqueville's view, and bound to lodge uneasily in a democratic society, like a grain of sand in an oyster, capable of producing the occasional pearl, but otherwise a bothersome foreign body. Like later critics of democracy, such as Walter Lippmann, Tocqueville was thus ambivalent about the potential for manipulation of the public by the media. An elitist at heart, he doubted that many possessed the means to achieve reflective, self-assured conviction, as he called it. Unlike Lippmann's antagonist, John Dewey, he had only limited faith in the power of education to immunize the public against such manipulation. There was no way for people to educate themselves and develop their intelligence unless they can devote the time to the effort. To devote such effort to public affairs, the people would need to be freed of worries about their material needs, in which case they would no longer be the people, end quote. Indeed, the only remedy is for people to, quote, become accustomed to respecting intellectual and moral superiority, end quote. This hope was destined to be disappointed. Tocqueville also anticipated what we would now call the problem of technocracy, the tendency for an elite stratum of officials qualified by expertise in the arcana of government to separate themselves from the general population and become a kind of political caste. Quoting again, however coarse a democratic people may be, the central power has no difficulty drawing to itself what little enlightenment exists in the country. Hence, in a nation that is ignorant as well as democratic, a prodigious difference between the intellectual capacity of the sovereign and that of each of his subjects will inevitably manifest itself. The administrative power of the state grows steadily because it alone possesses sufficient skill in administration, end quote. In 1835, he still hoped that America would prove exceptional in this regard because enlightenment was more evenly distributed there. True, he said that the number of the learned in America was small, but so was the number of the ignorant. In New England in particular, everyone received instruction in the elementary notions of knowledge, doctrines and proof of his religion, the history of his country and the principal features of the Constitution that governs it. Even in the ruder reaches of the American frontier, he was stunned to discover, quote, how rapidly thought propagates through this wilderness, end quote. Even so, the people would still be required to reflect on issues of which they have no firsthand experience. Mistakes were therefore inevitable, but the damage might be limited because while the majority in the United States often has the tastes and instincts of a despot, the most advanced instruments of tyranny are still lacking. But they would prove to be not all that difficult to acquire. I return now to the democracy of the spectacle. The democracy imagined by Tocqueville, springing from nature in towns huddled around the steeples of white-clappered churches, shepherded by men steeped in tradition and learning and blessed with sufficient leisure to reflect upon the great issues of the day, does not exist. In place of this locally rooted democracy, we have the geographically rootless, disembodied democracy of the spectacle. In place of town meetings, we have a form of participation that is vicarious but emotionally intoxicating, almost a gladiatorial spectacle. We can see this if we're watching the recent Supreme Court hearings, which unfortunately teaches nothing about the actual problems of governing or mechanics of achieving consensus. Citizens observe and judge, applaud and jeer, march and attend rallies, while governors, adept at using the technologies of mass communication, constantly monitor opinion, the better to mold it. They don whatever masks they need to nudge the needle of approval upward or divide one portion of the House against the other. The result is increasing dissensus rather than consensus. For most of us today, to be an active citizen means simply that we tune in. We are spectators, more or less engaged spectators, but spectators nonetheless, of the activity of the state. Or rather, some of us are. Others tune out entirely, or worse, tune in only selectively when the contest reaches a fever pitch. The substitution of the more comprehensive term media for Tocqueville's newspapers is no mere updating. Changes in technology have affected a change in substance. When citizens used to read about the deliberations of Congress in their newspapers, they could engage with arguments, understand democracy as deliberation, and appreciate the dilemmas faced by the decision makers. Technology has progressively changed this perception at a distance of the processes of government. When people learned the news of government action primarily through reading, the governing institution that loomed largest in their minds was the legislature. Tocqueville recognized this. Nothing, he wrote, could stand in the way of the majority, for the legislature represents the majority, which claims to be the sole organ of reason. Today, however, the image of the legislature is at a low ebb. A recent Gallup poll put the public's approval of Congress at 17%. The presidency has replaced the Congress as the central institution of the central government. It is the president who represents the majority, or rather, as the French like to say, who incarnates the majority. There are many reasons for this change, too many to explore here. As the size of government has grown, the power of the executive branch has grown with it. America's transition from peripheral power to sole hyperpower, dominant on the world stage, has been matched by the rise of an imperial presidency. The increased centrality of the presidency satisfies a need on the part of those whose participation in the public sphere is increasingly vicarious. When the central institution of democracy was the legislature, there was a problem of incarnation. The legislature did not speak with one voice. It did not represent a singular will. There remained what the political philosopher Claude Lefort calls an empty place, where some yearned to hear a univocal voice capable of quelling their fears and fulfilling their desire for a clear direction. Instead, there was only dissension. It is no accident that the demise of democracy was traditionally linked to the figure of the demagogue, the singular voice capable of bringing clarity to confusion, which occupied Lefort's empty place. And it is no accident that in the democracy of the spectacle, the central power, embodied in the executive rather than the legislature, represents not reason, but will. The advent of modern communications technology has magnified the danger of demagogy. As Roger Chartier has shown, print historically was a medium that fostered inwardness. The reader's inner voice entered into silent dialogue with the writer. By contrast, the orator subdues his listener, silencing the inner voice. First radio and then television multiplied the number of ears that an orator could reach. Tocqueville marveled that a newspaper could deposit an idea in hundreds of minds at once. Television can do the same in millions of minds, and with a visceral immediacy to which print cannot aspire, but only at the cost of coarsening the idea, or even replacing it together with mere affect. Even more than radio, television enveloped the head of state in an aura, established his real presence among the host of spectators. This unprecedented bond between the human incarnation of the central power and the simple citizen altered the relation between center and periphery. Individuals could simultaneously become more psychologically remote from their fellows and yet feel more closely tied to the central power, whether to admire or revile it. The ordinary citizen no longer felt the need of an intermediary body to act as protector or intercessor. Her relation to power became immediate, intimate, and one-to-one. Identification replaced association as the means of participation in acts of the sovereign will. Candidates propose themselves for office today not to become the government, but rather to overcome it. Rather than the twin poles of elite and people that Tocqueville saw, a part of the electorate now identifies passionately with the chief executive as the incarnation of its will, with the government itself cast as the chief obstacle to the sovereignty of the people, a novel representation of American democracy that we have recently become to seeing enacted daily on Twitter or Fox and Friends. In the second volume of Democracy, Tocqueville argued that democracy in America would lead naturally to the concentration of power, but he thought that this would come about because intense faith in equality would lead to the conclusion that simple and general laws could be applied to all in defiance of subsisting differences between subgroups of the population. He did not foresee how efforts to reduce those differences could promote a backlash, nor did he anticipate how a group threatened with the loss of its privileges could seek identification with a leader sufficiently contemptuous of the pieties of egalitarian dogma to declare openly that certain races, religions, and nationalities did not deserve to partake of America's plenty. He did not foresee how the false sense of intimacy induced by the modern media could circumvent reflection and mobilize atavistic passions he thought had been banished from America by its inhabitants' instinctive piety purged of sectarian intolerance. In short, he did not foresee the deep moral crisis into which an election like the last presidential election could plunge us. I say moral crisis rather than political crisis because, to reiterate one last time, Tocqueville held that mores are more important than either laws or physical circumstances in determining the fate of a nation. Ultimately, it is the moral character of the people that determines whether democracy will survive. And while Tocqueville believed that America's point of departure, as he called it, had endowed its people with many positive moral traits, he saw that these were not unalloyed. Many Americans, he wrote, exhibited violent passions, harbored only the vaguest ideas about the nature of society and the world, and barely know their neighbors. Quote, "How powerful do customs remain," he asked, "when a people has changed its face entirely and continues to change it constantly? When every act of tyranny has its precedent and every crime its example? When one can find nothing so old that one hesitates to destroy it, or think of anything so new that one dares not attempt it? What resistance can mores offer when they have already yielded so many times?" Thus, we return to where I began. Can an active citizenry compensate for such moral decay if the people themselves cease to offer resistance? It is difficult to make the people participate in government, Tocqueville wrote. It is still more difficult to provide them with the experience and inspire in them the feelings they would need to govern well. I began by asking what importance Tocqueville ascribed to participation. The answer, I think, is this. An active citizenry is the sine qua non of good democratic government, but the actions of a citizenry without the proper experience and feelings, those are Tocqueville's words, will only make things worse. This is a dark thought, but it has become increasingly difficult to ward off the darker side of Tocqueville's work, which in any case never lies far from the surface. So thank you for your attention.
We have about 25 minutes for discussion. I would ask that we'll start with a student question first, if there are any. And if you could wait for me to bring you the microphone for your question, I'd be grateful.
Hi, thank you for coming. That was really interesting. Towards the end, you started to allude to these ideas of moral decay. So could you talk a little bit more what that means in either the Tocquevillian view or in your own view?
In my own view, it has to do with intolerance of differing opinions, of social differences, of economic differences, of racial and ethnic differences. What I see is increasing intolerance, unwillingness to come together, to search for compromise, and a tendency to regard the political opposition as an alien part of the population, as not really included in one's own definition of the demos. This tends to lead not only to intolerance in the realm of opinion, but to the expression of actual violent sentiments, which we see more and more in political rallies around the United States. This is not to say that this has never happened before in the American past. I'm not trying to say that this moment is uniquely polarized, because that would be far from true. There have often been moments of intense polarization and, of course, even a civil war in American history. So it's not as though we haven't been through such moments before and have found ways to overcome them. But at the moment, the mutual alienation seems to be growing, and that's what worries me.
Thank you very much for what was such a clear and I just think such a perceptive reading of Tocqueville. There's one part of what you said, and only one, that I read just a little differently. And I see more connection between what you're calling socialization through the town meeting process and fitness for collective decision making, some of which is political. So my reading of him has tended to be that sometimes he's trying to find a way to transmogrify what a good aristocrat used to do into some way for common people to do something somewhat like it. And so the good aristocrat kept in mind peasants and handicraft people. The commoner can only begin to keep in mind more than him or herself and the close group of family and friends through encounter with others who are giving their gripes, say at a town meeting. And I've seen that as socialization, but socialization in part that prompts a reflection that keeps people making political choices about more than their own interests. And I loved your reminder that he has a much more steeply hierarchical view, and he circumscribes. I tend to forget that now because I don't assign every part of the book, so now I'm not reading parts of the book, that he isn't imagining they're making the big time decisions. But when I think of college students today and how they all, in every application essay for postgraduate study, et cetera, are writing about their encounters with diverse populations and how that's formed their ability to reflect on more than themselves. And I'm finding just one teeny sliver of hope that some of that's going on even in a world that is full of democratic spectacle.
Yes, thank you very much for that remark. I think it's useful corrective to what I said. I agree, by the way, entirely with your reading of Tocqueville and your use of his analogy between the good aristocrat, which was also an idealization of what Ancien Regime society was actually like, and the leaders that he hoped would emerge from the bosom of democratic society. That's exactly the point I was trying to make when he borrows from Montesquieu but tries to reread it in a democratic context. So that's quite right. And I think you're also right to chastise me for giving a darker view of the present than one more inclined to credit the incredible mobilization of grassroots social movements that we have seen in various parts of the country, particularly among women, mobilizing because of what they see as lack of respect for women's rights in the public sphere. Also among young people, my own children are much more politically engaged than they were in earlier years because they feel it's become necessary to do so. And that these kinds of movements might be taken as a form of Tocquevillian association that would replace the failure of the town to do what he's hoping it would do. I tend to be somewhat skeptical of the staying power of social movements. As a child of the 60s, growing up within social movements, I think they do mobilize people for a certain amount of time, but over the long haul, for what Max Weber described as the essence of political activity, which is the long, slow boring of dry, hard boards, that's what politics really is. And people become mobilized and engaged in movements for short periods of time, but then in what the social scientist Albert Hirschman called shifting involvements, as they grow older, they tend to withdraw once again into the private sphere. But who knows? We're standing on the cusp of this moment. I don't know where it's going to go. Your hopeful reading may be more accurate than my pessimistic reading. But thank you for the remark. Dan.
For me, it was a great talk. I took so many notes on interesting phrases that come out of Tocqueville, but also your own terms. One of the phrases from Tocqueville was the self-assured conviction that emerges from the agitation of doubt. And I'm just wondering if you could open that up intellectually, philosophically, perhaps even religiously, what some of the implications of that are. A possible follow-up is whether you feel that the opposite of that is any more characteristic of one side of the American political spectrum than the other, because I think that the lack of this agitation of doubt is probably as characteristic of the academic and political left as of the right. But I actually think that there's this kind of deep set of reflections about doubt in Tocqueville that's just maybe worth bringing out more.
Well, doubt, that's a very astute remark. Doubt is a central feature of Tocqueville's character, and it begins with religious doubt. He had a deep religious crisis. He was brought up by a Jansenist tutor to whom he was very close, and he writes one of his most moving letters. This tutor dies while he's in the United States, and from the United States he writes back to his family a letter describing how much this religious upbringing had meant to him. But as I mentioned, his father had a well-stocked library of all the Enlightenment authors, including some of the most skeptical religious authors, and Tocqueville read them all in his teens, and I think at age 16 had a deep religious crisis. And although he writes throughout his work about religion as an important underpinning, a source of the cohesion of democratic society, a necessary one, he doesn't really believe. For him, religion has some important functions. It expands man's temporal horizon, so that, to build on the previous question, this is one of the ways that individuals are drawn out of themselves and their immediate surroundings, not only physical but temporal surroundings, and induced to look at the long term over many generations. Now, he thought that this came naturally to aristocrats, where estates were passed on from one generation to the next, and where family feeling, the blood lineage was a very inherent element of the social definition of this group. So democracy needed to find some compensation for that, and he thought that religion could do it. He worried about religion in Europe because it had been the source of religious wars going back to the 16th century, but he thought that Americans had miraculously overcome that, because all that mattered in America was that one participate in some religion. Withdrawal from non-practicing was frowned upon in America as he saw it in his day, but it didn't matter what you practiced as long as you practiced something. And he was struck by the way that streets in front of churches were closed down on Sundays, so that traffic could not pass in front of the churches. And this was a public law. All churches were treated in the same way. So this struck him as an indicator of the equality of all religions in the United States. So doubt was central to his character, and I think he believed that statesmen should always have doubts in their mind, because certainty about political matters was impossible. Prediction is difficult, especially about the future, as that philosopher Yogi Berra once put it. And Tocqueville very much took Yogi Berra's dictum to heart. So now your point about lack of doubt in current American political life, perhaps you're right that the campus left is just as intolerant intellectually. There are certainly many cases to which one could point, of which that's an indication. I tend to think of governance not in terms of the political officials who are elected to run the country, but of the permanent bureaucracy, the people who actually manipulate the mechanics of government. I think many of them are instilled in their minds from the time they are educated, is the notion that it's very difficult to know what results any policy is going to achieve. The possibility of perverse consequences of any particular course of policy is something that's uppermost in the minds of most bureaucrats. And it's that kind of uncertainty which I think used to have more influence on the political leaders, who themselves felt a certain hesitancy to move confidently without the advice of people who understood the mechanisms of government more deeply than they did, that has gone by the boards. Political officials now take their own unaided instincts and reason to be their only necessary guide, and tend to slough off advice that they don't want to hear. Now, maybe that's been true more often than I like to think, but it does seem to me that it's more characteristic of recent times than of earlier times.
You talked about how the town meeting in New England was like meant to, in a way, like curb revolutionary sentiments among the people and like prevent them from going beyond their bounds, so to speak. How did Tocqueville feel about the revolutions in like 1830, 1848? Did he feel that that was beyond what the people should do and democracy should develop gradually? Or did he support that more outspoken revolutionary sentiment?
Well, revolution always troubled him. The reason he came to the United States after the Revolution of 1830 was that his position was as an administrator in the French courts. And in order to continue in that position after the Revolution, he would have had to swear an oath of allegiance to the new government. Since he, and more particularly his family, disapproved of that government, he didn't want to swear that oath. So he applied for a grant to travel to the United States to study prisons. In 1848, he first warned against the possibility of revolution to the officials who were in charge before the revolution. He saw it coming. But the revolution took a more radical turn than even he had anticipated. And at that point, it began to frighten him. He at first thought that some wise policy changes made in time would have been enough to tamp down the revolutionary sentiment. When that didn't happen and a first revolution occurred, he thought, I told you so. But then the revolution took a more radical turn and he began to panic. He thought there was going to be no way to control this. He began to engage in some backroom intrigue, some would call it conspiracy, as various possible responses to the Revolution of 1848 emerged. And he described some of this intrigue in his memoirs entitled The Recollections.
Hello, thanks for an interesting talk. I'm asking this question as somebody who is not a citizen and looks at the United States as an observer. I missed one term in your presentation, which was that of the tyranny of the majority and how that relates to active citizenry. So it seems to me, if you look at the current state of the Union, the split between reds and blues, and not just along state lines, is pretty representative. Take anything from political correctness, let's say on the left side, to the stubbornness of a Donald Trump on the other side. There are symbols, for me at least, to be anything that smacks of, or that smells of moderation or meekness is being dismissed. Yeah? There's this combative attitude, totally unhealthy, I think. But I don't think it's just one side that is here to blame. So I wonder whether you have any comments on that.
Yes, well, I think I did mention the term tyranny of the majority and Tocqueville's worries about it. When he conceived of it, however, I think he was thinking he imagined a large people of essentially equal citizens who were equal in wealth and income and education, as well as political power, and then a small elite on top of that, a property elite. And he was worried about the expropriation of the property by the large majority of those who had only small property holdings. So when he speaks of the tyranny of the majority, I think it's that tyranny that he's mostly worried about, that those who had large property holdings would be expropriated. And that is a classical worry about democracy, going back to ancient times. The tyranny of the majority that we worry about today, I think, is rather the tyranny that you worry about, that a majority will come to power, perhaps legally, or perhaps even, our current president was elected with a minority of the popular votes, as we know, but according to the rules of the Constitution, he is the legitimate president. So there is a legitimately empowered government, but one that seems to be intolerant of not only the views of the opposition, but of the traditional norms that have prevailed in democratic institutions. So when Obama nominated Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, normally that nomination would have been acted upon, but the Republican majority refused to do that. Tocqueville would have viewed that violation of norm, I think, as an exercise of tyranny of the majority. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what your question inspires in my mind.
A troublesome aspect of your talk, it seems to me, is that if it's not qualified, it comes across as the kind of patrician's view of democracy. Because what you seem to be saying, particularly at the beginning, was that an active citizenry is a good thing unless it votes for candidates that you happen to find abominable. Now, if we consider your idea of democratic spectacle, the democratic spectacle, as you describe it, is not something that is new. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, would she have been elected as a result of the democratic spectacle or something else?
Yes, I don't think I think it's characteristic of our time, not of one political party. I think your more general remark is a fair criticism of my talk, that it does come across as patrician. I was emphasizing what I think is a patrician strain in Tocqueville's own reading of democracy. In some of the email exchanges among participants in the University of Virginia seminar that I discussed, that I mentioned at the beginning, one person who's here, Jean Peterson, I think remarked that her view of Tocqueville has changed in the 2 years since the seminar took place because of changes in the American democratic polity. And that's very much true of my own view. I would not have given this talk 2 years ago. And as I concede, it may be an unduly dark talk coming out of a moment that I find and freely admit is a reflection of my own political prejudices. I think I said that when I quoted from Tocqueville's alarm about the Montagnards. I probably had more sympathy for the Montagnards than Tocqueville had and would have had I been a citizen of France in 1848. I had more sympathy for, among Tocqueville scholars, there is a split. There is a left reading of Tocqueville and a right reading of Tocqueville. The left reading of Tocqueville emphasizes the participatory democracy aspect. And I would have been more enthusiastic about that side of Tocqueville and given a less critical reading of it 2 years ago. But I've become more wary of the potential for the, what is I will admit, maybe a genuine expression of majority sentiment, but which goes against my views. Yes, in that sense, you're right. That is a perhaps alarming aspect of my reading of this moment, but it does grow out of that sentiment that I've seen a danger in democracy that did not seem as prominent to me before the last 2 years.
Thanks for that very enjoyable talk. So I'd like to go back again to your own presuppositions here, if not patrician, then perhaps progressive, and ask about the local. So I agree with you that the town represents a social matrix. But if it's so, it seems to me that it's unlikely that the local no longer exists. And it seems, I think that you're saying that the local, somewhat ignorant locality is accepting a price, if you will, from the center from which emerges a politics of spectacle. And that seems to me to be a progressive reading. And is there not an agonistic reading that's just as consistent with Tocqueville and with Madison, for instance, where if we look at a longer time scale, we find that from the Anita Hill hearing emerges the Year of the Woman, and so on. In other words, isn't it possible that that localities may always get the Kavanaugh hearing wrong and not particularly know much about whether someone has the qualifications of a Supreme Court justice, and yet get the politics right, but just not in 1 or 2 cycles, but over several cycles?
Yeah. Well, I think that takes me back to my answer to the previous question from the woman on this side of the room. In fact, to go back even further, one might say that the cause of my pessimism in this moment is really an outgrowth of an eruption of democracy at the local level. If you read the Tea Party, the first wave of this populist sentiment that has brought Donald Trump to power, if you read the Tea Party as a reaction to the mistakes of earlier democratic majorities, one could read that as an authentic expression of democracy at the grassroots level, a pure form of Tocquevillian association. Those Tea Parties were organized by local organizers. That's one view of how they came into being. Now, there's a contrary view advocated by Theda Skocpol and her collaborators that says they weren't as local as they seemed. They were financed by money that came down from above and so on. But I will concede the point that what I am seeing as a potentially tyrannical majority emerging out of populist sentiment through manipulation from the center of the media landscape in which our democracy has evolved, it might in fact be the true expression of of local associations of people who felt excluded and neglected by the policies of the past 30, 40 years. So yes, that's a fair challenge to the assumptions that underlie my paper.
We have time for one more question, after which I invite all of you to join us at our reception just down the hall in the Great Room. And if you're participating in the conference tomorrow from off campus, don't leave the reception without waiting for me to show you to the conference room tomorrow. So we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I was wondering a bit about the interpretation of Tocqueville, Tocqueville's notion of associational participation and also local town government as simply education to limits. Because it seems to me that over and over again, there's this phrase that keeps coming back again all the way to the very last chapter on democratic despotism, and that was that these associations, associational involvement, both, especially the interaction between political and civil associations reinforcing each other as a kind of virtuous circle, would have this, this cumulative effect of educating judgment to national politics. And that's why he says it's very dangerous to have people make decisions on national affairs when they don't actually have any skill in local ones. But that seems to me more an argument about the kind of cumulative effect of political education and lesson education to the limitations of politics. In other words, I think there's isn't there a real difference between saying he was trying to avoid revolution and then saying he was really trying to teach about the limits of politics? It seems to me he was trying to, even when he uses the word liberty, it invariably means political liberty and not individual liberty. That's what his difference with John Stuart Mill. So I keep wondering if maybe you're, I don't know, understating the degree of, the degree to which political skill was actually central to both the relation between associations and national politics for him.
Yes, I think you're correct both in your interpretation of Tocqueville and in your critique of my paper that I understated that cyclical functioning of associations, going from the private civil society type of association to the more political association, and the skills acquired in each would feed back, and there would be a continuous feedback. The example he gives of the way private association proceeds into political association is a question of tariff policy that arose in the 1830s. And people first began to organize among private groups that would be affected by the tariff in one way or another, and then move from those private associations into public associations and eventually a call for a constitutional convention to consider the question of tariffs and so on. So yes, one might tell that story in a different way, but I think the unfortunate fact about Democracy in America is that although it's a great book, it's a very disorganized book. So you can read through it many different through lines. I'm giving you one reading of a through line about associations that can be taken through many chapters, but it is only one reading. And I recognize that there are alternative readings that one might give. And I think when I say that my own view of Tocqueville has changed in the past 2 years, the change has to do with emphasizing one particular set of readings over another. No doubt, if I live long enough, my interpretation will shift back again. I've been reading Tocqueville for many years, and at different stages of my life, I've had different interpretations. So I think it's very astute of you to point out that I've left out some things, and I'm giving a very partial reading here, but I wanted to make a statement.
Thank you all for joining us for what was, I think, a wonderful presentation and discussion. Let's please join me in thanking our speaker.
And thank all of you for coming.